So good afternoon, Wayne. It's great to be speaking to you. So just to give a summary of what the interview is about, on the 27th of October, Global Rights Compliance submitted an Article 15 communication to the International Criminal Court on behalf of 200 Tamil victims of deportation, deprivation of the right to return as an inhumane act, and persecution as committed by the Sri Lankan authorities in Sri Lanka and the UK. Wayne, as a world-leading expert and barrister in international humanitarian law and co-founder of Global Rights Compliance, what inspired or motivated you to take on this case?
Well, no, first of all, my organization worked on the Myanmar case at the International Criminal Court, and we represented 400 women and girls in relation to a challenge which essentially asked the ICC pretrial chamber to rule on whether crimes which take part or occur partly in one country but also in another, whether you can bring a case in relation to both countries. So Myanmar was about whether crimes which had started in Myanmar and completed in Bangladesh, whether the case could be brought in relation to Bangladesh. And the pre-trial chamber said yes. And so I was approached by a lawyer who represented Sri Lankan refugees and asylum seekers, who wanted to know whether we could use the same precedent in relation to Sri Lankan Tamils who'd fled or been deported from Sri Lanka and ended up in the UK. And so we started to look at the question and came to the conclusion that it could be used.
So am I correct in saying that you have used a similar model to the case of Myanmar back in 2019?
Yes, and representing these women in from Myanmar, women and girls, was the inspiration for this, because the opportunities for justice for the Rohingya were very slim, and there's not many places you can go to try and find some accountability for them. And so the ICC opened up a very narrow possibility. And so I think when I look at the situation of the Sri Lankan Tamils and the way in which they're treated by the government and the way in which they leave the country, having been forced out through persecution and torture, it struck me, looking at those facts, looking at those crimes, and looking at the very narrow possibilities for justice for the Sri Lankan Tamils, that we should try.
Thank you, Wayne. And what powers would Article 15 of the Rome Statute give to the ICC prosecutor in the case of Sri Lanka?
Well, Article 15 is really just the article which allows individuals, NGOs, states to send information to the prosecution, and the prosecution then to conduct what's called a preliminary examination, which means he looks at that information and decides whether it's sufficient, whether there's a substantial basis to believe that crimes have been committed which fall within the jurisdiction of the court, to be then move forward to a full investigation.
Thank you. And what do you think are the prospects of success of the ICC permitting an investigation into the international crimes committed in Sri Lanka?
Well, I've been involved in a number of communications to the ICC in relation to Ukraine, in relation to the Myanmar, as we just spoke about. And to be honest, this is the strongest communication I've submitted to the ICC. The evidence is really quite overwhelming that these crimes are occurring. It's quite crystal clear from the 200 victims that we represent that there are thousands, if not tens of thousands more. And so since 2009, when the Sri Lankan government ended the war and the Tamils, or the military arm of the Tamils, was defeated, it's crystal clear that the government has been involved in a policy of persecuting the Tamils, from a long time before then, actually, but let's just stick with the more recent years. And so there's overwhelming evidence of a range of acts of abduction, unlawful detention, torture, deportation, deprivation of the right to return, persecution in the UK, persecution where the Tamils end up in other countries seeking refugee status. So there's no doubt that these crimes occurred, and there's no doubt that they're continuing to occur. The question will be whether these men who we allege are responsible, that is the President of Sri Lanka, the current Secretary of Defence of Sri Lanka, Kamal Gunaratne, and others, whether they're responsible and whether and to what extent. And I would say the evidence against them is really looking pretty strong.
And what do you think will be the main challenges involved in both filing the communication to the ICC and forwarding the same to the UK authorities, police authorities, for action against President Gotabaya Rajapaksa?
Well, the biggest challenge is that he's sitting as a president. And so the UK will be very reluctant to arrest him. The ICC processes take a very long time and tend to, because of a lack of resources, take even longer. And so the biggest challenge is that he's president and that the processes are very slow. But justice is a long game. He won't be president forever. And if we can encourage the UK to fulfill its obligations, which is to investigate these types of crimes, whether they occur on the UK soil or not, and when we can encourage the ICC to investigate crimes which occur in Rome Statute signatory states like the UK, then we can inch forward. It won't be without challenges, but on the basis of this evidence, as I say, the challenge will not be the evidence. The challenge will be whether we can get hold of the president.
And lastly, if the request to investigate is successful, what can the victims expect to happen next?
Well, what will happen next is that the prosecutor would open up a full investigation, which would mean he would move from considering the information as submitted to him on paper and move to sending investigators to Sri Lanka and or to the UK to investigate, to interview witnesses and so on. So that's what happens if the prosecutor is satisfied that there's a reasonable basis for believing that these crimes, the crimes of deportation, persecution, and deprivation of the right to return, have been committed. Again, it will take some time, but on the basis of the communication we've filed, there's plenty of evidence. To my view, the prosecutor could move quite swiftly, or should be able to move quite swiftly, to a full investigation.
Thank you very much, Wayne. It was a pleasure meeting you on here.
Pleasure is mine. Thanks.